Hello Bio 2. We're going to continue on with our second part of amphibians, and our first body function that we're going to look at is circulation today. So circulation, so in frogs and other adult amphibians, the circulatory system forms a double loop. So in fish it was just a single loop, so now it's kind of getting a little more advanced here, and the amphibians, they now have a double loop. And so how this works is that the first loop will carry oxygen-poor blood from the heart to the lungs and the skin, and then it'll take oxygen-rich blood from the lungs and skin back to the heart. So it's basically just it's kind of just going from the heart to the lungs and the skin. So it starts in the heart, moves to the lungs and the skin, and it takes that oxygen-rich blood from the lungs and the skin back to the heart. And then the second loop will transport the oxygen-rich blood from the heart to the rest of the body, and then carry oxygen-poor blood from the body back to the heart. So those are the two loops that are found in a heart of an amphibian. So now for some little anatomy here, we have the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, the ureter, the urinary bladder, and the cloaca, which are all parts of the amphibian circulatory and excretion systems. So we've kind of know for the most part what most of these do, but we'll get to them more in particular, more in depth as well. So to start with the heart, so the amphibian heart has 3 separate chambers. So the fish heart has 4, now the amphibian heart only has 3. So we have the left and the right atrium, and we have what's known as the ventricle, which we have already mentioned before, which is the actual pumping portion of the heart. So if we look, here's the structure of what an amphibian heart looks like. And again, you can see the 2 loops here when we have incoming blood from the lungs, and then so starting up here on the right side, look at the pointer here, it starts, blood comes from the lungs, goes up, goes back through, and it goes back to the body, to the lungs, and to the skin. And then we have one that's from the body, and then we have it coming out, and it goes to the body, to the lungs, and to the skin. So those are our 2 separate loops that are found in the circulatory system. So for excretion, amphibians have kidneys that filter waste from their blood, so that's one of the main functions of the kidneys, to take waste out of the blood. And then another part of their excretory system is urine, and it'll travel through tubes called ureters into the cloaca. So the function of a ureter is just a tube that urine travels through, which again comes out of the waste from the blood from the kidneys. And then urine is then passed directly to the outside, or it could be temporarily stored in a small urinary bladder just above the cloaca, and then it will be removed at a later time. And so then for reproduction, for our next body function here, in most species of amphibians, the females will lay the egg in the water, and then the male will fertilize them externally. So that means female goes across the bottom, lays the eggs, and the male will come around and fertilize them after the eggs have already been laid. However, in a few species, including most salamanders, the eggs are fertilized internally. So there's never really just one method found in any of these groups. There's always exceptions to the rules, and this is it. The salamanders, most eggs are fertilized internally. And after fertilization, frog eggs are encased in a sticky, transparent jelly. So if you've ever seen frog eggs floating down at the bottom of a pond, I'm sure most of you have, they're all basically in a big sticky jelly mass there. And then this jelly mass this jelly attaches the egg mass to underwater plants and makes the eggs difficult for predators to grasp. So they're really basically slimy, slippery. Predators can't really get a hold of them. And then the yolk inside, the purpose of the yolk is to nourish the embryos, so basically the food source for the developing embryos. And then most amphibians will abandon their eggs after they lay them, say sayonara, good luck. However, there are a few amphibians that take care of both eggs and their young, and the example actually is the African bullfrog that we have over in the corner of the room. The male actually will take care of all of the babies after they are hatched to make sure they survive and make it through the dry season. And so here's kind of life cycle of how a frog goes through its changes, and we'll kind of break down each one of these steps more in depth here. So first is that adults are typically ready to breed in about 1 to 2 years. And so then again, frogs are going to be our example. So frog eggs are laid in the water and they undergo external fertilization, so that's step 1. The next, the fertilized eggs will hatch into tadpoles a few days to several weeks later. So we have again, you can see here in this picture, we have our big jelly-like mass of eggs. Then they hatch out and we have a tadpole. And the tadpole will eventually grow limbs, and then they will lose their tails and gills. and they will become meat eaters as they develop into terrestrial adults, and then 1 to 2 years pass, and then they start the whole process right back over again. So that's basically how frog life cycle works. It's pretty simple, nothing too complex, and we probably all have observed that at some point in our life here. And so for our next, again, characteristic make them a living thing is movement. So amphibian larvae, they move by wiggling their bodies and using their flattened tail for propulsion. We can see here in our tadpole they have a very long flattened tail, and that's helped to use them swim through the water. And then as adults, salamanders will walk or run. So they have legs. Their bodies, again, are very similar to a lizard. And then we have frogs and toads. They have well-developed hind limbs that enable them to jump long distances. So I'm pretty sure we probably all observed that before. It's kind of what they're most famous for, is their ability to jump. And so that's how the movement, that's pretty much the most kind of exciting the movement it gets. They either walk or run, or then the frog and the toads jump. And then for response, amphibians have very well-developed nervous and sensory systems. And one kind of function that kind of helps them protect this well-developed nervous and sensory system is what's called a nictitating membrane. So that's a really important word. You're going to have to be able to know what this is. And it's saying that an amphibian's eyes are protected from damage and kept moist by a transparent nictitating membrane. And this membrane is located inside the regular eyelid and can be closed over the eye. So there's been times where people have walked over to the frog tank, they look over, said his eyes almost look kind of hazy, and that's because he has that second nictitating membrane that's covering up his eyes. Well, they can basically, the whole purpose of it is they can swim underwater, they lift that eyelid up, their eyes are protected, and they can still see. So that's a really important thing you're going to need to know, is what a nictitating membrane is. And then another important word, kind of sounds similar but has very different functions that kind of helps them respond, is that amphibians can hear through their tympanic membranes, or just simply their eardrums that are located on each side of the head. And the bullfrog has the American bullfrog has a very distinct tympanic membrane, which we'll see in our next picture. And then another function of them that helps them respond really well is that many amphibian larvae and adults have lateral line systems that help them detect water movement. Again, it's just kind of going along with the whole thing. Fish have this as well, that they can pick up the electrical currents in the water along this lateral line system. And so here's a picture. Again, the big round circle here this is actually a frog's ears. It's their eardrum, the tympanic membrane. And then again, in the humans, your eardrum is called your tympanum, so it's basically the exact same thing. So that is it for Amphibians Part 2. Let me know if you have any questions.